Hello guys, and welcome to tonight's journey into the past. This video explores the legend of King Arthur, the once and future king, the sword in the stone, and the dream of a kingdom built on honor and destiny. Before we begin, comment below where in the world you're watching from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to see, and if you enjoy this calming experience, don't forget to like the video and subscribe now, because chances are you'll be asleep before it ends. In a time before crowns, before knights, before kingdoms or courts or coats of arms, there was only the land. It did not know peace, nor order, nor hope. It was damp and wild and heavy with silence, a silence that clung to the soil and crept through the trees and settled into the bones of those who tried to call it home. There were no roads, only paths beaten by hooves and bare feet. There were no maps, only memories of rivers and ridges. No firelight flickered from windows, because there were no windows. Only slits in mud walls and wooden shutters that groaned in the wind. The forests were endless and old, older than the men who feared them. They stretched from the highlands to the valleys, from the coasts to the hidden stone circles buried in moss. The trees whispered in a tongue older than Latin, older than any prayer, a language of wind and warning. Weaves roamed freely, their howls haunting the dusk. Bears wandered the edges of farms, drawn by the scent of livestock and desperation. There were no towns, only villages, and even those were fragile. Clumps of huts circled around fires, trying to hold back the dark. People did not thrive, they endured. Their days were ruled not by law, but by weather. Rain could flood the crops, frost could kill them, and the sun was a gift they learned not to count on. Hunger was not a season, it was a way of life, a thin broth, a hard crust, a handful of roots, was enough to make someone cry with thanks. Clothing was simple. Wool if you were lucky, rags if you weren't. Shoes were rare, feet were calloused, bleeding, cracked from walking through brambles and frost. The people were not ignorant, but they were unprotected. No walls guarded them. No leaders truly served them. No one was coming to save them. They were ruled by strong men. Men who knew how to swing a sword or steal a horse or threaten with a torch. The powerful took what they wanted. The rest survived if they could. Villages were raided not by distant enemies, but by neighbors, by desperate bands of hungry men. And when the sun rose the next morning, nothing was left but ashes. There were no names to remember, no songs to pass down, only the aching weight of fear, and the long, cold nights that seemed to never end. Even the stars, it seemed, had turned away. The sky was often covered in cloud, gray upon gray. Only a faint glow hinted at the moon's presence, and when it rained, it did not stop quickly. Days could pass under drizzle, weeks under storms. Roofs leaked, beds were damp, children coughed in the corners of huts, and mothers tried to keep their babies warm with whispers. If a stranger came into your village, you watched him carefully, He might be a traitor, or a thief, or worse. Trust was a luxury. And yet, in the middle of all this, the land endured. The rivers still ran, the trees still grew, and somewhere deep beneath the soil, the story of a king had begun to take root. He was not born yet, he was not dreamed yet, but something was coming. Something that would lift the people out of the mud and into memory. A name not yet spoken, a sword not yet drawn, a destiny not yet written, but first they would suffer. For the darkness must deepen before the dawn can mean anything at all. The hunger was not only in the stomach, it was in the soul. A hunger for warmth, for order, for something to believe in. The people had little, a roof if they were lucky, a patch of land with barley or beets, a goat or a handful of chickens. If the raiders hadn't come, every day began the same, not with an alarm, not with sunlight streaming through linen curtains, but with the ache of a cold floor beneath bare feet, and the question, will we eat today or not? There was no breakfast table, just yesterday's bread, if any remained, water from a nearby stream, muddy and chill. No coffee, no fire that lit itself, no hum of machines to greet the morning. Only the wind and the dampness that clung to stone and skin alike. Men rose early, toil in the fields with wooden tools and frozen fingers. Women mended clothes by the dim light of an oil lamp, while keeping the youngest warm with body heat. Children, if old enough to walk, were old enough to work. No shoes, no school, only duties that kept the family breathing. One more day, illness came often, a cough that wouldn't go away, a fever that turned lips blue, a scratch that swelled into something deadly. There were no clinics, no medicine, no doctors, just the herbalist, the midwife, the priest with a prayer and a thin candle. The people prayed, not from faith alone, but from fatigue, from fear, from the desperate hope that someone was listening. The gods they prayed to changed, from Brahman to Christian to local spirits of forest and well. But the pleading always sounded the same. Keep us warm, keep us safe, keep the wolves and war away. But the wolves came anyway, so did the war. Sometimes from across the hills, sometimes from inside their very gates. Steel did not shine in those days. It rusted quickly. It was crude, heavy, unrefined, and yet it was law. The sword decided everything. Who ruled, who starved, who lived to see another gray dawn. Men with power carved out territories, not with scrolls, but with violence. Land was taken and taken again. Blood soaked the dirt. Names were forgotten. Legacies were burned with the homes of the defeated. There were no newspapers to report it, no maps to track the lines of conquest. Only rumor and fear and silence. Families disappeared. Villages vanished. One day a field was full of grain. The next it was scorched and bare. Ghosts replaced the harvest. And still the people endured, because what else could they do? To die was simple. To To live was the real burden. But something strange happened. In those quiet, broken years, in the midst of chaos, people began to imagine something else. Not a warlord, not a priest, not a thief with 10 men and a torch, but a king. Not a man who took, but a man who gave. A ruler who brought peace, not because he feared rebellion, but because he believed in something greater than himself. They had no name for him, only a hope, a figure they whispered about near the fire after the children had gone to sleep. A king who would rise from the people, not above them. A king who would carry a sword not for conquest, but for justice. The stories were few, simple, childish perhaps, but they grew from dream to tale, from tale to belief. And though the mud was thick, and the nights were long, and the fields were often empty, something had begun to stir in the human spirit. A longing, a vision, a waiting, not for rescue, but for meaning. For the first time in a long time, the people looked past the next meal, past the next storm, past the next raider. They began to look forward, and in the distance, they imagined a crown, not of gold, but of hope. The sky rarely smiled. It wept, mostly, drizzling sorrow across the thatched roofs and flooding the lowlands with silent grief. Even in summer there was no joy that felt safe. Too many years had ended in famine. Too many harvests had rotted before the bread was baked. The people no longer trusted the good days. They came like a breeze, but vanished before the table was set. And so they lived not with joy, but with waiting, a kind of dull, quiet endurance, no expectation of better, just a hope that things wouldn't get worse. There were no calendars to mark the year, only the cycles of the moon and the turning of soil, and the aches in the joints that warned of rain. Life passed in rhythm, but not in celebration, only in repetition. The sound of tools against stone, the bleating of sheep, the creak of wooden wheels, the sob of a mother burying her third child. These were the sounds of the world, not music, not laughter, not ceremony. And when voices rose, it was usually in fear. The toll of a distant bell, the cry of a scout on horseback, the scream in the woods, cut short by something with claws or steel. Even dreams had dulled. There was no time for them. Sleep was shallow, interrupted by wind or firelight, or the shifting shadows of something unspoken. The priests preached of heaven, but it felt so far away, not just in distance, but in design. What kind of paradise was built for people who had never tasted peace, cut short by something with claws or steel? What was a golden gate to someone who had never seen a gate at all? What was forgiveness when no one had the time to sin? Only to survive, the stories of saints and angels felt like rumors from another world. They came down from stone pulpits, but never touched the earth beneath bare feet. Still, the people bowed their heads. They folded calloused hands. They offered whatever coins they had, hoping, perhaps, that their pain would be noticed, that somewhere A god or a spirit or a forgotten ancestor was watching, and that one day someone would come, not a prophet, not a soldier, but a king. A man not of heaven, but of earth, who knew the pain of frostbitten fingers, who had walked muddy roads, who could speak not in riddles, but in reason. They didn't want miracles, only fairness, only peace. Not perfection, just an end to the chaos. And so they waited, quietly, faithfully, not for a savior in the clouds, but for a leader who could live among them. And in this waiting, something began to change. The people became storytellers, not just of survival, but of hope. They'd passed tales from hut to hut, of a man who would carry a blade of light, who would rise from humble origins, who would restore what had been broken and build what had never been built before. Not a kingdom of stone, but of trust. Not a court of gold, but of justice. Not a ruler of power, but of promise. They didn't know his name, but they whispered about him still. And though no birth had yet occurred, and no sign had yet appeared in the sky, somehow they knew. They knew, not from scrolls, not from prophecy, but from instinct, as if the land itself had begun to murmur something new. The rivers flowed differently. The trees leaned inward, as though listening. The wind spoke, not in moans, but in murmurs, whispers without language, but full of meaning. Some said they had dreams of a sword and stone, of a hand rising from water, of a boy in a cave learning not how to fight, but how to wait. Others claimed visions of a crowned stag in the forest, of a fire that would not burn the hand, of a lake that reflected stars that weren't yet born. Were these truths or desperation? It mattered little, because what they created in the mind began to give shape to what had never been real: hope. Not the kind sung by choirs, but the kind whispered by grandmothers to children falling asleep beside cold hearths. A hope that said, it will not always be like this. That one day mud would give way to stone, fear would give way to peace, and a boy born somewhere out of sight would rise to carry the weight that none could bear. His name was not known, but his legend had already begun. In every village, someone told the tale differently. He was a farmer's son, or a lost prince, or a boy raised by wolves or by druids, or by fate itself. He was strong or quiet or clever or kind, but always he was fair. He would not come to conquer. He would come to restore. And though the swords were still sharp, and the fires still cruel, and the kings of the time still fought over scraps, the people began to prepare, not their walls, but their minds, not their armies, but their stories. For the king would not rise in gold, but in silence, not with trumpet or banner, but with presence. He would be one of them, but not like them. He would walk through forests where no path had been carved. He would ride not for glory, but for balance. And when the time came, he would lift not only a sword, but a kingdom. He would not erase the pain, but he would give it meaning, not a savior, a symbol. of what they had suffered, of what they had endured, of what they still believed in, even now. And so the land waited, as did the people, as did the story itself. And somewhere in the mists of an island, in the hush before the dawn, a baby's cry echoed through the fog. And though no one knew his name yet, the world had already begun to shape itself around his legend. The king would come, not today, not tomorrow, but soon. And when he did, the silence would break, not with war, but with wonder. In the quiet fog of legend, something sharp was waiting. It began with a whisper, not a sound carried by wind, but something deeper, a shift beneath the soil, a tremor behind the eyes of those who dared to dream while awake. The kingdom had no name, number king, and no future. But the land remembered what the people forgot, and in the folds of myth, something had been planted. In a field long overgrown, between ruined stones and silent birds, there stood something impossible, a sword embedded in cold, ancient stone. It had no guard to protect the hand, no jewel to tempt the greedy, no name etched into the blade, and yet those who saw it felt it speak. Not in words, but in memory. It did not shimmer in sunlight. It did not glow with magic. It simply existed, still, solid, unmoving. And in its stillness, it drew the gaze of wanderers, fools, knights, men dressed as kings, priests in robes too clean for soil, thieves with hands too quick to pray. Each one approached the sword. Each one touched it. Each one failed. The sword did not resist. It did not pulse or shake or blind. It simply refused, as if it were not waiting for strength or blood or status, but for permission. The people began to gather, not in crowds, but in awe. They built no temple around it. They dared not. For some said it was cursed, others said it was divine, but all agreed on one thing: the sword had chosen the stone, and until it chose again, none could remove it. It became a monument to silence, a shrine to failure, a riddle with no words. And time passed. Seasons rose and fell. Kings lived and bled and vanished. Empires cracked like pottery dropped in haste. And the sword remained, unburdened, unclaimed. But somewhere, far from the stone, a boy was being raised in the care of a man who spoke more to animals than to kings. He did not know his name in full. He did not know his parents. He did not know the blood that moved in his veins was the same blood that once wore a crown. He knew only the quiet of the woods, the language of owls, the patience of trees, the way fire curls when spoken to softly. He was not strong. He was not fast. He did not ride like warriors or speak like poets, but his heart did not tremble when the sky turned gray, and his hands did not flinch when touching something broken. He did not chase power. He carried kindness, like a coin in his pocket, unseen, but always close. And one day, This boy would walk toward the stone, not to conquer, not to prove, but simply because he had to, because the world had waited long enough. The boy did not know he was being watched, not by spies or soldiers, but by fate itself, something old and quiet that had watched countless kings be born and forgotten. His name, whispered only in shadows, was Arthur. Not yet a king, not even a knight, just a boy with clear eyes and rough hands, who listened more than he spoke. The man who raised him, some called him a wizard, others a madman. To Arthur he was simply Merlin, a keeper of riddles, a friend of stars, and a teacher who believed that every answer began with silence. Merlin taught him not just to read, but to wait, not just to ride, but to yield. He said, "A king who rushes to rule will soon rush to ruin." So Arthur learned patience. He watched wolves without fear. He listened to rivers until they told him when to drink. He studied clouds until they taught him when to speak. And yet he still did not know what waited for him beyond the trees, until one morning when the frost kissed every leaf and silence blanketed the land like an old song. They arrived. Riders, clad in cold armor bearing crests of broken dynasties. Men who called themselves noble, but whose swords were heavier than their honor. They came not for war, but for a tournament, a contest held in a crumbling town where banners still fluttered, though no wind remained, for word had spread the sword and the stone would be tested again. The High King had died. His throne now stood empty, and the land once again felt the cold breath of chaos. So the nobles gathered, each claiming birthright, each bearing lineage written in ink and soaked in blood. Arthur came not to compete, but to carry a sword for another, a servant to a knight. Too proud to carry his own blade, he said nothing as they mocked his rags, his silence, his youth. He watched quietly as they failed one by one, grunting, shouting, cursing at the stone as if force could replace worth, until the knight he served realized he'd left his sword behind. "Boy," he spat, "fetch me a blade." And so Arthur ran through alleys of dust, past inns and churches and faded flags. But the armory was locked, no blade to be found, no smith in sight. And then he remembered a stone, a sword, not in a hall, not behind glass, but in the open, waiting. He found it alone. No guards, no crowds, only silence. And something in him felt as though he had been here before, in dream or in life. He stepped forward. No fanfare, no prophecy. Just a hand reaching out to what had always been his. The sword slid free, like a whisper from a sleeping mouth. No light burst from the sky, no voice declared a king. Only the sound of metal meeting morning air. He brought it back, thinking it just a sword, but those who saw it, those who felt the shift in their bones, knew otherwise. The boy had done what no king could, because he did not try to take, he simply came when he was called. At first, no one believed it. The boy claimed no triumph. He stood quietly, blade in hand, unaware that the world had just shifted beneath his feet. The knights laughed. A child, pulling the sword? Impossible. They demanded he do it again. Not in secret, not alone, so the sword was returned, pressed again into the cold stone, the same stone that had humbled dukes and silenced kings. And once more Arthur placed his fingers upon the hilt, not with force, but with stillness, and once more it rose, as if it had never belonged to the stone, but had only been waiting for a hand that wouldn't close too tightly. The crowd hushed, not with awe, but confusion, suspicion. Some cried fraud, others blamed sorcery. A few simply stared, because in their hearts they felt what their minds could not accept. Change had come, quietly, through a boy. No one had prepared to follow. The nobles rejected it. They screamed of bloodlines, of tradition, of maps and birthrights, and fathers' names carved in iron. But the sword did not care, and the stone did not speak. Only the people, the ones without banners, the ones without gold, began to murmur. They did not know him, but they recognized something they had not felt in years. Hope. It did not roar. It whispered, not like thunder, but like the sound of soil softening after frost. Arthur returned to Merlin in silence, his hands still trembling, his mind unsure whether this had truly happened, or whether the world had simply tipped sideways while he wasn't looking. Merlin did not smile. He did not clap or cheer. He simply nodded, as if he had seen the moment in a dream, long before it arrived. The sword chose you, he said, but now the world must. Arthur did not ask what that meant. He understood. For to lift a blade is one thing, but to carry what comes after, to bear the weight of expectation, of betrayal, of history itself, that is where kings are made or broken. He was no ruler yet, just a boy, with too many eyes upon him, but already the birds flew differently overhead. The wind curled with a softer shape. The land had felt it. And far across the kingdom, in corners forgotten, in villages where bread was scarce and cruelty common, a name began to spread, not as a shout, but as a sigh. Arthur. The name moved like a breeze through the valleys and hills. It passed from lips to ears in bakeries and stables, in taverns and temples, in whispers that felt like prayers. Arthur. The boy with no banner, the child of no known father, the one who pulled the sword, and though no throne yet waited for him, something deeper stirred, not in castles, but in hearts. He did not seek followers. He did not give speeches. He simply returned to the woods, to Merlin, to the quiet that had raised him. But the world had already changed. A ripple had become a wave. Merchants began to speak of him. Knights who once scoffed now wondered aloud. Some offered alliances. Others plotted in secret. For power is a strange fire. It warms some and burns others. Arthur, still just a boy, was caught in its early glow. He felt it on his skin, the shift in how others looked at him. No longer invisible, no longer just a servant. He was seen, and in being seen, he became dangerous. Merlin warned him, "They will come to shape you or to silence you." Both wear crowns, but Arthur did not yet understand. He still believed that doing the right thing would be enough. He did not yet know that the sword had awakened not only faith, but fear. In council halls and stone-walled keeps, men debated what must be done. A child cannot lead us. A peasant cannot be king. A sword and a stone means nothing, but deep down, they knew it meant everything because it had not been them, because it had not been chosen by gold or blood or name. It had been chosen by something older, something they could not control. And so, plans were made. Alliances shifted. Daggers sharpened in shadow. But Arthur knew none of this. He sat by the fire, feeding it gently, watching the sparks drift into the canopy of night. He did not crave rule. He did not hunger for crowns, but something inside him, a still steady ember, began to glow with quiet resolve. Not because he believed he was worthy, but because he knew deep down that someone must carry the weight if others are to rest. The sword now sheathed beside him did not sing, did not speak, did not shine. It simply lay still, as if waiting once more, for what comes after the pull is the path. And the path would not be easy, but it had begun. The sword had chosen him, but the crown remained a ghost. No council had placed it on his brow. No parchment had named him king. No bells rang through the hills, and the sky remained silent. Arthur lived in the in-between, neither child nor ruler. Seen by many, accepted by few, he returned to the woods, not in retreat, but in waiting. For some doors do not open with strength, but with stillness. Merlin said little. He only stirred the fire each morning, his staff tapping rhythms into the soil. He watched the birds. He spoke to the wind. And when Arthur asked, "What now?" he replied only, "Now you listen." So Arthur listened. He listened to the footsteps of hunters, to the rustle of leaves warning of rain, to the gossip of crows, to the way the world breathed when it forgot it was being watched. And in his quietness, he learned that the people did not trust easily. They had been burned by crowns too many times. They had seen kings ride by in golden armor while their children cried from hunger. They had seen thrones used as shields and swords used as law. To them, Arthur was not a miracle. He was a question, and questions, unanswered, can fester. In some towns, his name was whispered like a blessing. In others, it was spat like a curse. Rumors grew around him like vines on old stone. Some said he was a ghost, a spell made flesh. Others claimed he was a pretender, that Merlin had rigged a sword, that no boy could carry such destiny. But Arthur did not argue. He let the world speak while he remained still. For deep within, he carried a seed of patience planted long ago. by a man who knew that wisdom grows slowly. Still, there were moments, nights beneath the stars, when the silence was too wide, when doubt crept close. He would touch the sword's hilt in the dark, not to draw it, but to remember it had chosen him. Even if no one else did. The days grew longer, but the hours felt stretched thin, like golden thread pulled across the sky. Never quite touching the earth, Arthur spent his mornings in the woods, his afternoons beside the river, and his evenings by firelight, wrapped in silence deeper than sleep. He practiced, not with swordplay, but with stillness, not with orders, but with listening. The animals began to trust him. Foxes did not flee. Deer lingered. Birds returned to his shoulder as if sensing that this boy meant no harm to the world. In time, others came, not nobles or knights, but wanderers. A man with no name, who once served a butcher king, a mother and child, who fled war with nothing but a broken comb, a woman who whispered to bees and wore grief like a shawl. They came not to follow, but to rest, and Arthur led them. No tents were built, no banners were raised, but something invisible took shape in those woods, a stillness that welcomed those too weary for conquest. They sat in circles around quiet fires, sharing stories, not commands. They passed bread and gave thanks to no gods, only to one another. It was not a court, it was not a rebellion, it was something else. Merlin called it a seed of the thing that may be, and the seed grew. Word traveled slowly, as soft things often do. The boy who pulled the sword had not vanished. He had not claimed a throne. He had not begun a war. He had made space, and the people, those who had no voice in councils, no place in castles, they began to notice. Some came only to glimpse him, some came to stay. And while Arthur offered no promise, his presence itself was a kind of promise that there was another way, one without blood for borders or titles earned through fear. But not all eyes that watched him were kind. Far to the east, in crumbling fortresses, the old powers stirred. Men who had worn crowns so long, they forgot what their heads felt like without them. Men who saw the quiet rise of Arthur as an infection. And infections, they believed, must be cut out. So they sent spies and soldiers, and whispers dressed as warnings, but none could deny. The boy who once fetched swords for another was now holding something far greater, not a weapon, but the attention of the forgotten. The forest grew quieter as winter began to whisper through the trees. Leaves fell not in haste, but with grace, each one a parchment from nature, signed in gold, and left at Arthur's feet. He watched them fall as others came and went, trading stories for silence, offering wounds in exchange for warmth. He never called them followers. He never gave them titles. He simply sat beside them, and in doing so, led them, not from in front, but from beside. This confused those who watched from afar, the barons, the lords, the self-declared kings. whose rule depended on distance and fear. They could not understand this boy who ruled no land, yet gathered loyalty like fire gathers moths. They called him false. They called him a trick. Some even sent emissaries wrapped in velvet threats. But Arthur would not meet them in halls. He answered them not with letters, but with presence. And presence was enough. One morning, he awoke to find a banner tied to a branch near the camp, not one he had raised, but one painted by a child, a simple white cloth, a sun in its center, rays drawn like outstretched hands. Arthur said nothing, but he let it remain. Later, someone built a chair from old wood. Nothing grand, just something to sit upon beside the fire. And though Arthur sat on it like any other stump or stone, those around him began to pause before they spoke to him, not out of fear, but out of something gentler, recognition. Still he wore no crown, still he gave no laws, and yet peace held them together like thread through cloth. There were no guards, no walls, no treasury, but there was rhythm, soft footsteps at dawn, shared bread at dusk, laughter like candlelight in the dark. Merlin watched all this with knowing eyes. He spoke little, but he carved small runes into stones, burying them at the base of trees as if marking the edge of something sacred. And the animals remained, the foxes, the crows, the deer. They wandered through the camp, not like intruders, but like kin. For what Arthur had built was not a court, but a clearing. And in that clearing, the weary came to breathe. Winter arrived, not with fury, but with silence. The first snow came like a hush, covering the woods in soft white breath. It did not stop the camp, it only slowed it. And that, Arthur had learned, was not always a curse. In the quiet of frost, there was reflection. By now, his name had reached places he had never walked, across rivers, beyond mountains, even into enemy halls. The nobles could no longer pretend he was a tale. He had become a question they could not answer. Some sent word, asking him to meet. Others sent gold. One even offered a crown. But Arthur returned them all with the same reply. I do not wear what is not mine, because he understood something many kings never did, that a crown given too soon can become a shackle, that the weight of power must first be earned in silence, not by command, but by presence, not by decree, but by care. So he stayed in the woods, through snow and thaw, through wind and rest, and he learned the songs of the poor, not those sung with harps, but those murmured under breath, while tending fields and burying hope. He learned the way sorrow softens when shared around a fire, and he learned that a leader does not arrive with answers, but with ears. Still, the world beyond his forest grew louder. A warlord rose in the east, a man clad in black steel, who spoke of conquest as prophecy. He called Arthur the Forest Child, a weakling hiding behind trees. Others rallied to that voice. hungry for battle, thirsty for order. And so the peace around Arthur trembled. One night, as the camp slept beneath moon-pale branches, Merlin came to sit beside Arthur, his face half hidden in steam from his tea. He spoke slowly, as always, the quiet days, they end soon. Arthur said nothing, but he knew, he felt it in the frost, in the stillness of the deer, in the dreams that came sharper now. He looked at the sword beside him, still sheathed, still waiting, and he understood the world would not wait forever. The clearing had been a beginning, a cradle, but soon he would have to rise, not to seek war, but to stop one, not to take power, but to prevent its abuse. And as dawn broke through the thin blue mist, Arthur stood alone beneath the sleeping trees. He breathed in, and for the first time, he no longer felt crownless. He felt ready. The wind changed before the sky did. It came not with thunder, but with silence, a strange stillness in the leaves, a pause in the bird song, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Arthur felt it first in his chest, not as fear, but as knowing. The peace had been long, unusual, a thread of warmth in a kingdom used to steel and fire. But all peace, no matter how gentle, must one day be tested. News arrived not on horseback, but in fragments. A merchant whispered of burned villages. A child spoke of black flags. A widow wandered into camp, her home behind her, her silence deeper than any wound. A name passed among them, like a shadow over light. Mordred, a warlord, a knight once cast out, a man with charm and rage. He had declared himself not king, but judge, and in his eyes Arthur's quiet strength was weakness. He called Arthur the sleeping boy, mocked the peace he had built, claimed the sword had been pulled by trickery, and more dangerously he promised order. To those hungry he offered bread, to those forgotten he offered a banner, but under that banner villages bowed in silence or burned in defiance. Arthur heard each tale not with panic, but with weight. He sat longer at the fireside. He walked farther into the woods. He spoke less. Merlin, as always, said little. But his carvings changed, no longer soft runes of safety. Now he etched warnings into the stones, marks of protection and preparation. The clearing was no longer enough, and Arthur knew the time of only listening was drawing to a close. Arthur did not summon anyone. He called no banners, sent no messengers. He wrote no decrees, and yet they came. From the hills and hollows, from fishing coves and broken roads, they arrived without fanfare, riders with tired horses, farmers with axes meant for wood, healers with herbs cradled like children, not because they had been summoned, but because they remembered. They remembered the boy who sat beside them without judgment, who listened before he spoke, who shared the fire as if it were his only throne. They came not for war, but for protection of something fragile and nearly forgotten, hope. Arthur met them without ceremony. He greeted each one with the same calm nod. He asked their names. He listened to their stories, and then he welcomed them not as soldiers, but as souls. Still, he knew this peace could not hold. Not when Mordred's men were marching through villages, stripping them of choices. Not when fear was spreading like frost before a storm. Arthur did not want to fight, but he could not allow the land to be carved into silence. So he walked each morning through the new encampment. Not inspecting, but observing, he noticed who limped, who sang while they worked, who braided herbs into the tent poles for luck. And when night came, he stood beneath the dark violet sky, his sword still sheathed, and asked the wind, "Must peace always bleed?" Merlin stood beside him, his staff pressed into the soil. He didn't answer immediately. He only watched the fireflies drift like thoughts through the trees. At last he spoke. "Sometimes to keep a garden, you must scare away the wolves." Arthur nodded, but not in agreement, only in understanding. He knew he was not a gardener, nor a wolf, but something else, a gate, and soon he would have to open, or close. Word of Arthur's gathering spread like mist through the valley. It did not roar, it whispered. Tavern keepers spoke his name in low tones. Travelers asked if the boy with the sword was still listening more than leading, and still the question hovered in every corner of the kingdom. Would he fight? Would the boy, who had once refused a throne, now raise a shield? Mordred seemed eager for the answer. He sent his riders farther, into borderlands and marketplaces, spreading coins with one hand and fear with the other. His message was always the same. Arthur is a ghost. He hides behind trees. He dreams while I act, but the people had seen ghosts before, and Arthur was no ghost. He was the moment before thunder, the hush before the wave. In the forest clearing, preparations began, not for war, but for protection. They trained not as an army, but as neighbors. Axes were sharpened. Shields were shaped from wood once meant for walls, and Arthur watched it all with quiet sorrow. He spoke often now, not in commands, but in reminders. He reminded them why they had come, what they carried, what they defended. Not land, not titles, but memory, a memory of what peace could feel like, of what listening could sound like. He walked among them at dusk, his hands empty, and somehow that emptiness carried more weight than 100 banners. He found the boy who stuttered and taught him to breathe before he spoke. He sat beside the woman who feared the sound of metal and let her speak of her past until the fire died. And in each moment he planted something, not strength, not skill, but belief that they could hold the line, not for glory, but for gentleness. Still, the night grew colder. Birds flew south. The moon hung longer in the sky, and the wind brought with it the scent of steel. Arthur knew what it meant. The waiting was almost over. It began not with trumpets, but with footsteps. The scouts returned at dawn, faces pale, cloaks wet with frost. They had seen them, Mordred's men, thousands, marching beneath banners black as ash, armor that drank the light, faces hidden behind steel, so that mercy could not find them. They moved like one creature, slow, wide, inevitable. The camp stirred, not in panic, but in breath, one long, shared breath. Children were sent to the far woods. The sick were given warm blankets and quiet paths to safety. And those who remained did not pray for victory. They prayed for each other. Arthur stood at the forest's edge, his sword now slung across his back, but still untouched. He looked out beyond the trees, into the fog. Somewhere out there, a storm of iron was gathering. Merlin joined him, his voice quiet and deep. You need not become them. To stop them, Arthur nodded. He knew. He would not raise fire to fight fire. He would not wear a mask to meet a mask. He would walk into the storm as himself. No crown, no fanfare, only belief. Behind him, his people stood. Not an army, not warriors, but witnesses to a different kind of power, a power not taken but given. As the sun climbed, its light spilled like honey through the mist, and in that golden hush, Arthur stepped forward, not to begin war, but to stand where gentleness might otherwise break. He did not raise his voice, he did not roar. He simply looked to the trees, the tents, the faces he had come to know, and softly he said, "We protect what we've built, not with anger, but with truth." Then he turned toward the path that led out of the forest and into whatever waited beyond. Not a king, not a knight, a boy with a sword and something more powerful than both, conviction. And thus the storm met its match, not in might, but in meaning. And the first step he took that day was not toward battle, but toward legend. The mist rolled in like a slow breath from the earth, thick, gray, quiet. It gathered at the ankles, then rose to the knees, then swallowed the waste until the world was no longer trees and sky, but a pale ocean without wind. Arthur stood at its edge, the last of the clearing behind him, the unknown ahead. He did not speak. He did not draw his sword. He simply waited as the fog wrapped around his boots like a silent cloak. Behind him, his people moved softly, not in rows, but in rhythm. Mothers placed hands on sons' shoulders. Old men gripped staffs made from broken fences. A girl braided her sister's hair, as if it were mourning, as if war were not crawling toward them. No banners flew. There were no horns, only the whisper of leaves and the heartbeat of breath. They had not come to conquer. They had come to remain, and Arthur, he had not come to rule. He had come to remember. The path before them curved down into the valley, where Mordred's men waited, sharp-edged and shielded, faces hidden, souls forgotten. They would not wait long. Arthur stepped forward. Each step pressed into the wet earth like a vow. Like the ground itself would remember where he had been. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if waking the soil, as if the fog was listening. And perhaps it was, for within the mist there was a stillness that did not feel empty. It felt watched, not by men, but by memory. The memory of those who had fallen before for the wrong kings, the wrong crowns, the wrong gods. Arthur did not walk for them. He walked for the ones who had no songs, the quiet ones, the forgotten ones, the broken-hearted, who built the world but were never allowed to name it. Behind him, the camp followed, not with shouts, but with steps, soft, steady, like a heartbeat, beating back the dark. The fog thickened until it was not fog, but memory. The trees disappeared, the sky dissolved, only sound remained. A footstep in the mud, a sword shifting in its scabbard, a child's breath, barely held. Arthur could not see the path anymore, but he walked it still, guided not by sight, but by something deeper, a knowing that what waited beyond this mist was not just a battle, but a question, and the answer would not come from steel. It would come from stillness. Behind him, his people walked in silence. No armor clanged, no orders were shouted. They carried tools more than weapons, ropes, torches, blankets. They were not prepared for conquest. They were prepared for holding on, for holding each other. Merlin walked with them, his staff brushing the ground like a whisper. Every few paces he stopped and laid a pebble down, a small round stone carved with simple marks, protection perhaps, or memory, or both. Arthur said nothing, he only listened, and in the quiet he heard things, not voices but truths. The land murmured beneath his feet, the fog sighed against his skin. The sword on his back grew heavy, as if remembering its purpose. Still, he did not draw it. He could feel the tension ahead, like a string pulled taut between two old songs. Mordred's camp was close, too close, and somewhere within that mist, the other army waited. They too would feel the fog. They too would see nothing, and yet they would charge, because that is what fear demands. Motion, noise, force. But Arthur knew that not all power was loud. Sometimes it was breath, so he stopped, and so did those behind him. One by one they paused and waited, not for battle, but for the fog to part. Time slowed, not by magic, but by meaning. The world hidden in fog became a place without edge, without direction, without escape. And still Arthur stood. He could hear their breath, not the enemy's, but his own. The soft rise and fall, like waves lapping a distant shore. Around him, his people waited, some with pitchforks, some with boughs too small, some with nothing but the will to stand. A young man beside him held the hammer, his knuckles white. He whispered, "I'm afraid." Arthur did not answer with words. He only placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, solid, warm, and in that gesture was 100 oaths. You are not alone. You are not wrong to feel. You are enough. Then a sound, not the crash of charge, not the clang of war, but a shuffle, metal over stone, boots in the muck. They were coming from the east where the land dipped low, marching without form but with fury. Mordred's men wrapped in steel, faces hidden, hearts long buried. They entered the fog like shadows entering a dream. Arthur saw only flickers, a helmet gleaming, a spear point rising, a torch behind his shield. His people braced, some crouched, some closed their eyes, and Arthur, he stepped forward. Only one step, but it was enough. A hush swept through his side, a silence, louder than fear. He still had not drawn his sword. Not yet. The mist swirled, and from within it came a voice, deep, cold, the sound of stone sliding down a mountain. It was Mordred. Where is your king now? Arthur did not answer. Another voice rose. I see no crown. Arthur did not move. Then came laughter, sharp, cruel, a crack through the fog. And at last, Arthur spoke. His voice was not loud, but it moved, not through ears, but through bone. I am no king. I do not need a throne to stand. And with that, he stepped once more into the mist, not toward safety, but into the space between fear and memory. The fog thickened around Arthur, like a memory too heavy to hold. Each step he took sounded louder than it should. A soft squelch of boot and soil, a rustle of cloak, a slow inhale. Across from him, Mordred appeared. The fog peeled back, just enough to reveal his form, tall, armored, wrapped in cruel elegance. His face, sharp and pale, carried no wonder, only command. Where Arthur stood like soil, Mordred stood like stone. What is this? Mordred sneered, gesturing at the scattered villagers, the makeshift camp, a boy with a sword and a song of peace. Arthur met his gaze not with defiance, but with stillness. I do not need an army, he said, only a reason. The fog moved as if stirred by the words. Mordred scoffed. He raised his sword. Then die with your reason, and he stepped forward. But he did not charge, because something held him, not a force, not magic, but the air itself, heavy with witness. Behind Arthur, the people did not run, they stood. A woman with her shawl tight across her chest, a child with wide, dark eyes, an old man, gripping a wooden spoon like a scepter, and the fog held them all, like a single breath not yet exhaled. Mordred raised his sword again, but it shook, because this was not the battle he had imagined. There was no chaos, no war cry, only Arthur, his sword still sheathed, and around him a silence that refused to die. Then, from somewhere unseen, a sound, not a trumpet, a bell, soft, distant, like something ancient remembering itself. It rang once, then again. Mordred hesitated. He turned his face slightly toward the sound, and in that pause everything shifted. The fog did not lift, but the fear within it did. Arthur stepped forward, not to strike, but to stand. He placed a hand on the hilt of his sword, but did not draw, and that gesture was louder than any blow. Behind him, his people followed, not to attack, but to bear witness. They walked forward through the mist, past Mordred's men, who did not strike, did not move, because even they, in their armor, in their fury, felt it. The war was not in steel. It was in meaning, and Arthur, quiet as the earth, had already won. The battle had passed, but the silence it left behind was louder than war. Arthur stood at the edge of the field, where fog once danced and hearts once held their breath. Now there were no footsteps, no voices, only wind weaving through the grass. Like a mother braiding hair, Mordred had vanished, not slain, not captured, gone like a shadow. When the sun refuses to rise, Arthur did not celebrate. He did not smile. He only watched the morning form itself from the pieces of night. Behind him, the people moved carefully, as though the air might break. They'd picked up dropped cloaks, whispered names, held each other. Without saying why, there was no victory song, no feast, no fireworks in the sky, only peace, and even that was fragile. Arthur felt it, the weight of stillness. It was not relief, it was responsibility. Peace, after all, was not the end, it was the beginning. He walked the empty ground where the fog had once shielded him, where no sword had been drawn, and yet so much had been changed. And then he heard it. A creak, a groan, a whisper, the sound of wood being dragged, or built, or broken. He followed it, through trees that bent with memory into a clearing that had not been touched. Since before the storm, there they had built it, a throne, made not of iron, but of things they knew. Tree roots, old shields, the handle of a blacksmith's hammer, the side of a wagon once lost in a flood. It was not beautiful, but it was true, and it waited, not for a king, but for a question. Would Arthur sit? The throne stood not as a symbol of rule, but of remembering. It did not gleam, it did not rise, it did not shout, it waited. Arthur approached it slowly, each footstep cushioned by damp earth and thought. He did not fear the seat. He feared what it might mean. To sit was not to command, not here, not now. It was to accept the weight of every gaze, every silence, every hope not yet fulfilled. Around him his people formed a ring, not tight, but respectful. They left space, not for glory, but for grace. Merlin stood beside an old stump, his hands clasped before him. He said nothing. He had said enough. Guinevere stood farther back, braiding a length of torn cloth into her wrist. Lancelot held a child too young to understand, and yet too quiet not to feel. All waited, not for Arthur to speak, but to choose. Would he sit? Would he carry what they could not? Arthur placed one hand on the throne. It was warm, despite the cold air, worn smooth from many hands, many tools, many offerings. A blacksmith had carved the back. A baker had stitched the seat. A hunter had strung the frame with sinew and prayer. It was not built for comfort. It was built for memory. He thought of the sword still sheathed on his back. He thought of the fog, the stillness, the moment when war chose not to speak. And he thought of something deeper, that to lead was not to rise above. It was to kneel into the weight of everyone else's dreams. So he sat, not quickly, not ceremonially. He lowered himself, as if sitting into history, and the air did not cheer. It sighed, as if the forest had been waiting. The throne did not change him. It did not glow. It did not shine. It simply held him like a memory holds a face, gently, without permission, without escape. Arthur sat quietly, his hands resting on the arms not carved with lions or laurels, but with the lines of tools, of homes, of lives. There was no crown upon his brow, no circlet of gold, no scepter of command, no robe heavy with velvet. And yet no one questioned who he was, because Arthur, seated there, became not a ruler, but a reflection. They saw in him the best parts of themselves, the quiet strength of the woodcutter, the steady patience of the shepherd, the humble endurance of the woman who wove cloth for the fallen by candlelight. He was not crowned, he was believed. Merlin stepped forward. In his hands he carried a simple band woven of ash oak, and a single feather, no jewels, no spell, only care. He held it out to Arthur, and Arthur did not take it. He looked at it, as one might look at a question too large for words. Then, softly, he said, "I do not need this to lead." Merlin nodded. "I know," and he turned and placed the crown on the throne's back, not the head, a symbol, not a burden. And with that, the wind stirred through the trees. It was not loud. It did not scatter leaves. It simply moved, like understanding, like peace. The wind moved through branches older than kings, carrying no scent of war, no sound of triumph, only the hush that comes when something sacred has been seen. Arthur sat still. He did not rise. He did not speak. He simply breathed. Around him, his people began to settle. Some sat upon stones. Others knelt upon grass, still damp from morning fog. Children leaned into their mothers' shoulders, and old men folded their hands. No one asked what came next, because sometimes what comes next is rest. The kingdom, if it was to be built, would not rise in towers or castles of carved stone. It would rise in the way a man lifts a plow for his neighbor, in the way a girl leaves bread at another's door without name or note, in the way a weary soldier lays down his sword because he sees no one else holding theirs. And so the kingdom was already there, in every gaze that did not judge, in every silence that did not demand, in every hand that reached not for power, But for peace, Arthur closed his eyes. He did not sleep, but he let the day settle into him like roots returning to soil. The sword on his back remained untouched. The crown behind him remained unseen. He needed neither, because what he carried was not the crown, but the knowing. That leadership was not a fire to burn others, but a warmth to keep them alive. And as dusk drew near, and the shadows lengthened, the people did not leave. They remained quietly, together, not for Arthur, but for one another. And in that stillness, beneath fading light, the kingdom was born again. Without fanfare, without decree, only breath, only presence, only peace. The wind shifted, not with force, not with storm, but with something quieter, older. It whispered across the hills, sweeping through broken hedgerows and empty fields, where the earth lay bare, cracked, like a heart too long denied. Arthur stood at the edge of a river that no longer sang. Its waters had thinned, receded, left behind a bed of stone and memories. Small bones, dried reeds, a rusted clasp from a child's cloak. Long forgotten, the land was tired, not from time, but from silence. Too many stories had been buried beneath swords, beneath laws, beneath the weight of unspoken grief. Arthur felt it as a heaviness in the air, as if the ground itself was holding its breath, afraid to speak. What it had seen, he did not come to claim, not today. He had left the throne behind, and with it the burden of rule. He came now as a man, with his cloak pulled close and his footsteps slow. Beside him walked Guinevere. Her hands were empty, save for a ribbon. She let trail along the grass. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her silence was its own kind of listening. Behind them came no army, only a few villagers, a midwife, a mason, a boy who once threw stones at the river when it still ran blue. They did not know why they came, only that something was calling. Something beneath the soil, something beneath the sorrow, a hollow place where something once sacred had been sealed away. As they crossed into the old valley, the wind began to hum, not loud, just enough to feel, like breath behind your ear, like the sigh of someone almost ready to speak. And there, half buried beneath a mound of ivy and moss-covered root, they found it. An altar, or perhaps just the memory of one. Stone cracked in two, symbols worn away, but something remained. A feeling, a warmth, a sadness that did not fade with time. Arthur reached for the stone, but did not touch it. Instead, he knelt, not to worship, not to pray, but to listen. His fingers rested on the soil, cool, damp, alive. The others followed. No words were exchanged, no directions were given. They simply knelt, one by one, and waited. Birds did not sing, the sky did not clear, but beneath their knees, beneath the weight of stillness, the ground began to breathe. The land had a memory older than any scroll, any tale told by firelight. It remembered the first tree, the first wound, the first cry of a child born into a world too sharp to be held. It remembered when kings came with banners and left behind only ruin. It remembered when queens whispered to the rivers and the rivers answered. It remembered Arthur, but not as a conqueror, as a question, a hope not yet formed, and now he had returned, not to rule, to ask. The earth slowly began to answer. The earth beneath Arthur's fingers was not just soil, it was story. It pulsed gently, as if remembering how to breathe. He kept his eyes closed, letting the stillness speak. And in that hush, a feeling rose, not sharp, not sudden, but ancient. A sorrow pressed deep into the bones of the land. Not the grief of one man, not the pain of a single moment, but the slow accumulation of centuries, a sadness packed into the hills, the stones, the rivers that had run dry from being ignored. Arthur could almost see it, a woman kneeling where he now knelt centuries ago, offering milk to the earth for a harvest that never came, a soldier dragging his shield through the mud. After the war, no one won, a healer burned for knowing too much of roots and rain. They had all been here, not in this place, but in this feeling. The land remembered them, not by name, but by ache. Guinevere stood a few paces behind. She did not kneel, but she bowed her head. Her breath matched the wind, slow and invisible. She held no crown, no title, just a single silver thread drawn from her hair and tied to her wrist. She had once been called queen, then traitor, then ghost. Now she was simply present, and sometimes that is more powerful than power. A child wandered forward, the same boy who had thrown stones at the empty river. He crouched beside Arthur and placed his hand on the ground. He looked at Arthur and asked softly, "Why does the land feel sad?" Arthur opened his eyes. He did not offer a lesson. He did not give a tale. He only said, "Because no one asks it how it feels." The child blinked, then nodded, and left his small toy sword at the base of the altar, not as a gift, as an apology. The wind rose just slightly, and for a moment, only a moment, the sound of water returned. A soft trickle, a promise. The river was not yet healed, but it was listening. The villagers began to move, not in haste, but with care. They found broken roots and buried them. They lifted stones from hollow paths. They whispered words they did not fully understand, but meant. Not spells, not prayers. "Thank you, forgive us, we see you." The land did not answer with thunder. It answered with breath, cool wind against the cheek, a bird landing without fear. As dusk began to settle, Arthur rose. His knees ached, his cloak was damp, but his heart was quiet. He turned back toward the altar. It stood just as before, cracked, faded, but no longer forgotten. He reached for the feather, tucked in his belt, one that had fallen from Merlin's sleeve weeks ago. and been kept without knowing why. He laid it on the stone, and the wind stopped just for a heartbeat, as if the world, for one breath, exhaled. Night came slowly, as if reluctant to darken the work of day. The last gold light of the sun slipped across the hills, laying its hands gently on the altar stone, on Arthur's shoulders, on the cracked earth that had begun to soften. The villagers had not left, they stayed, not because they were told to, but because something in the air had shifted. Not magic, not miracle, but meaning. For the first time in memory, the land felt awake. The boy with the toy sword had curled beside the altar, using his satchel for a pillow. His breath rose and fell. In time with the wind, a woman lit a single candle near the roots of an old tree. She did not speak, but her eyes were closed, and tears moved slowly down her cheeks. She was not sad, she was remembering. Arthur watched it all from a stump worn smooth by time and sun. He did not speak, but in his silence he held space for everyone else to feel. That was his gift, not the sword, not the title, but the stillness, a kind of presence that let others breathe. Guinevere sat beside him. She had tied the silver thread from her wrist around the base of the altar. She said, without looking at him, "The wound was never in the land, was it?" Arthur shook his head. No. They were quiet again. The trees swayed gently, their leaves whispering truths only the stars could translate. And then a sound, soft, familiar, half forgotten. The river. It was moving again, just a trickle, a shy murmur. But it was there. Someone gasped. Another dropped their tools. And then no one spoke. They only listened. It is a strange thing to hear water return to a place long dry. Not like rain, not like waves. It is the sound of memory, being forgiven, the sound of something once lost, agreeing to return. If only you promised to listen. The villagers knelt once more, not out of worship, but gratitude. They knew now that they did not own the land. They were guests, caretakers, and caretakers must listen. Arthur rose again, his movements slow, his body heavier than before, but not from fatigue, from understanding. He made his way to the river's edge. Kneeling once more, he dipped his fingers into the water, cold, clean, alive. He brought the water to his brow and let it trace down his cheek. Not a baptism, not a blessing, just a moment between a man and the world he had once tried to rule, and now only wished to know. The stars had begun to appear, not in clusters, but in quiet, singular twinkles, spaced like thoughts across a tired mind. A gentle hush blanketed the valley, woven from wind, cricket song, and the soft trickle of the river finding its way again, through stone and memory. Arthur sat near the water, his boots damp, his breath slow. He was not king here. He was not warrior. He was simply a listener. The earth no longer cried. It whispered, and that was enough. Behind him, The villagers had begun to build something, not with hammers, not with blueprints, but with hands. They gathered small stones from the riverbank, placing them in a ring around the altar. No one told them to. They simply felt that something should be made to honor the silence that had spoken, a place not to worship, but to remember, to come back to breathe near, to listen again. Guinevere tied the final thread, a circle of bark and river reed, to a branch above the altar. It swayed lightly, catching moonlight like a dream that dared to return. Somewhere in the distance an owl called, and from even farther a reply. Arthur smiled faintly. Even the night, it seemed, was learning to speak again. He looked to the boy, still asleep near the altar. A small smile on his face. The child had placed a feather beside his sword. A gift for the river, a piece for the past. Arthur stood. He did not command them to follow, but they did. Not because they had to, because they wanted to. They followed not a king, but a man who had learned how to kneel. As they walked back toward their homes, lanterns in hand, the valley behind them did not darken. It glowed softly, as if the earth itself was exhaling at last. No decree had been given, no scroll signed, no crown worn, but the kingdom had been healed a little, not with war, not with gold, but with listening, with remembering, with care. And as Arthur stepped past the final tree that marked the edge of the valley, he turned once more, not to wave, just to see, to look upon a place that had been broken and dared to begin again. The land did not speak, but in the stillness a truth was clear. The wound was never the end, it was the beginning of becoming whole. There were days when the throne felt lighter, when the empire seemed to sing. But this was not such a day. The sky hung low over Aachen, heavy with winter. The air pressed downward, thick with something that could not be named. In the great chamber, Charlemagne sat alone. The council had gone, the scribes dismissed. Only the quiet remained. He did not speak to it, but he listened. His fingers traced the edge of a map on the table before him. Lines etched in ink familiar as his own bones. Borders he had drawn, cities he had claimed, mountains he had crossed, with armies and prayers. But today, the map did not feel like victory. It felt like a weight. He leaned back, his cloak folding softly. A whisper of wool and time. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting long shadows on stone walls. Shadows of a younger man, taller, faster, eyes alight with conquest. He had once dreamed of uniting all Christendom. One language, one law, one light beneath the cross. And for a time, it had seemed within reach. But empires do not sleep. They shift. They whisper. They resist. And so must their emperors. Even now, as the snows gathered, messengers rode. From the Saxon border, petitions arrived from Lombardy. Rumors stirred in the north. And yet he could not rise, not yet. He stared into the hearth, into the orange and gold, the soft collapsing of wood, the slow breath of flame. It reminded him of Rome, of that day, that frozen, dazzling day when he knelt in St. Peter's and the Pope crowned him Emperor of the West. He had not asked for it. Not then. Not in that moment, but he had accepted it with grace and with silence. The crown had been heavy, but the silence even heavier. Since then, the title had followed him like a shadow. Augustus, Emperor, Father of Europe, but no crown could answer questions that came at night. No title could make peace. With a soul restless from memory, he closed his eyes. The voices of his children echoed faintly, some still laughing, some long gone. The halls of Aachen had once echoed with footfalls, debates, songs of scholars. Now, only his breath filled the chamber, measured, slow, deliberate. He did not fear death. He did not even fear failure. He feared what would follow. Would the kingdom hold? Would his dream be passed down as he had intended, or would it fracture as dreams often do? When clutched too tightly, Charlemagne opened his eyes again. Snow tapped gently at the stained glass windows, like fingers seeking entry, soft, persistent, and in that sound he heard it again. That question that never truly left. What is a legacy, if not the echo of quiet choices? He stood slowly, the years showing in his knees, his breath catching. He walked toward the far wall, where a single tapestry hung, woven long ago by hands now gone. It showed a lion and a lamb beneath a tree of stars. He had hung it himself, not for glory, not for guests, but for himself, to remember that empires are not built only with iron, but with mercy, with vision, with the will to listen and to wait. Outside, the snow thickened. Inside, the fire held its glow. And the emperor, no longer young, no longer invincible, stood between both. Still, morning came without song, no birds, no horns, only the faint creaking of wood beneath frost and the sound of slow footsteps on cold stone. Charlemagne walked alone through the cloister garden where the monks once planted herbs for healing. The rosemary was buried in snow, the lavender long gone. Only the shape of the paths remained, winding, narrow like the questions he could not answer. He did not wear his crown here, nor his sword. Only a wool cloak and silence, the cloister's arches, still strong despite the years, framed his movements like a memory. He passed beneath them as if through time. The bell had not yet rung. The brothers still slept, but the emperor, he rarely slept as he once did. Sleep came shallow now, haunted not by nightmares, but by unfinished thoughts, the kind that wait patiently in the corners of rooms and the spaces between decisions. At the far end of the garden stood an old wooden bench, worn, splintered, faithful. He sat. The cold met him without apology, but he welcomed it. It reminded him that he was alive, that the body still listened. Even when the mind wandered, he watched his breath rise in clouds, as if his thoughts were escaping before they could be spoken. And then footsteps, soft, deliberate. He did not turn. He already knew. A monk approached, head bowed, robes heavy with dew. "Majesty," the monk said, barely above a whisper. But Charlemagne shook his head. "Not here," he replied. "Not today." The monk sat beside him, slowly, as if sitting beside a friend. They said nothing for a long while, only the sound of snow melting on stone. Finally, the monk spoke again. "There was a dream last night, a vision?" Charlemagne nodded, as if this was not rare. "In the dream," the monk continued, "a tree grew from the ruins of a broken chapel. Its roots wound through skulls. Its leaves sang scripture. The emperor closed his eyes. "And what did it mean?" he asked. The monk sighed. "I do not know. Perhaps that something holy can grow even from ruin." They sat again in silence. It was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that holds rather than hides. Charlemagne finally turned, his voice softer than it had ever been. "In battle or court, do you believe we've done enough?" The monk did not answer right away. Instead, he looked up at the bare trees, their branches sharp against the morning sky. "No one ever does," he said. "But the question matters." Charlemagne breathed in slowly. He thought of the children studying Latin in the palace school, of the scribes copying old Roman texts, of the churches built on quiet hillsides, of the peace he had forged with blood, then with ink, then with prayer. He thought of the broken places too, the villages burned in Saxony, the weeping he had not stopped, the oaths taken in fear, and the dream he carried still, a realm not of conquest, but of wisdom, a kingdom not won, but tended. He stood. The monk stood with him. They exchanged no blessing, no farewell, only a glance, and in that glance a kind of peace. As Charlemagne returned to the palace doors, his steps slow but sure, the first bell rang. It echoed across the garden, through the arches, into the sky. Not a summons, not a warning, just a sound to remind the world that time still moved, and that, perhaps, so could grace. The council gathered just past the second bell, long cloaks trailing, scrolls in hand, eyes sharp from too many winters. They stood beneath high beams, carved with lions and laurels, symbols of strength and judgment. But on this morning, judgment waited. Charlemagne entered last, not late, just deliberate. He walked slowly, not from weakness, but from reverence. The silence bowed as he took his place at the head of the long oak table where every voice eventually arrived. His crown rested beside him. He did not wear it. The room watched. He raised his hand, not to command, but to invite. "Speak," he said, his voice a low, steady river. The Bishop of Mainz spoke first, always first. He warned of heresies in distant provinces, of sermons that twisted scripture into prideful politics. He urged swift action, excommunication, correction. Charlemagne nodded, but wrote nothing. The Count of Thuringia followed. Bandits on the roads, a levy unpaid, a noble cousin, making claims beyond his right. Others followed. Borders, rumors, grain shortages, pilgrims robbed, abbeys crumbling. The emperor listened without interruption, not because he agreed, not because he was tired, but because he had learned that the shape of a realm is often revealed in the space between complaints. When the last voice quieted, he did not speak immediately. He stood, walked to the window, looked out at the snow-covered roofs of his city. The people moved slowly along the lanes. Smoke rose from chimneys. A mother carried wood. A child dragged a sled through frost. Life continued, not in edicts, not in battles, but in mornings like this. He turned back. No decrees today, he said quietly. The room shifted, confused. No punishment, he added. No reward. Not yet. The bishop frowned. The count stiffened. The younger scribes looked to each other. Charlemagne sat once more. I do not doubt your worries, nor your warnings, but today we do not fix the realm with ink. He placed his hand flat upon the table. We fix it by listening, by watching, by waiting. He paused. You want action? But I want understanding. The bishop opened his mouth, but closed it again. There was no argument prepared for patience. The emperor reached for the parchment beside him. Not a report, but a letter. The seal was broken. The ink faded. He read it aloud. It was from a village priest in the hills of Provence. The man wrote of illness, but also of joy, of new marriages, blessed under snow, of a boy who could now read Latin psalms aloud, of a woman once mute who now sang with the choir. The words were simple, but they shook the room more than politics ever could. When he finished, Charlemagne looked up. There's an empire on these walls, he said, gesturing around them, but there is another out there, and if we forget it, this one will fall. The bishop bowed his head. The count shifted his gaze. No vote was taken, no record kept. But something in the air had changed. Charlemagne rose again. You may go, he said. Return tomorrow. Bring me fewer fears. Bring me more truth. One by one they filed out, their footsteps quieter than when they had come. And when the door closed, and the chamber was still, the emperor sat once more beside the hearth. He reached for his father's ring, worn smooth with time, rolled it once between his fingers, and whispered almost to himself, a king rules with strength, but an emperor must learn to pause. The fire answered with a single soft crack. The stars had begun to appear, not in clusters, but in quiet, singular twinkles, spaced like thoughts across a burdened sky. A hush had settled over Aachen, not imposed, not ordered, simply felt, as if the city itself had taken a deep breath. and held it. Within the emperor's chamber, the fire still burned. Low, steady, its glow a memory more than a light. Charlemagne sat near it, not reading, not writing, but simply existing. In the long stretch of evening, the weight of the day had passed through him, but it had not broken him, not yet. He looked down at his hands, once strong enough to lift swords and shields, to ride for days, through wind and blood. Now they trembled slightly when still too long. They ached with the cold. They remembered things his mind had chosen to forget. He did not resent them. He only wondered what work they still had left to do. From a corner shelf, he drew an old wooden box. Inside letters, coins, fragments of prayers written by children, and beneath them a simple ring of iron, bent, blackened, precious. It had belonged to his brother, the one who had died, when the world still seemed to promise only beginnings. He held the ring in his palm like a question, and then he wept, quietly, without shame, not for loss, not for regret, but because the fire reminded him of how it feels to be warm and small and human. The door creaked. He did not turn. He already knew who had entered. Louis, his youngest, his quietest, his most uncertain heir. The boy, no, the man, approached softly, a scroll in hand. He offered it. But Charlemagne waved it away. "Sit," he said. So Louis sat, not as a prince, not as a soldier, but as a son. For a long time they said nothing. Only the fire spoke. Soft hisses, occasional snaps, like old truths remembering themselves. "I don't know how," Louis said finally. Charlemagne didn't ask what. He only nodded. "Good," he replied. "Neither did I." Louis looked at him, eyes wide, uncertain, and Charlemagne smiled. A real one, a ruler who thinks he knows. Before he begins, is the most dangerous kind. Louis bowed his head, not from shame, from reverence. The emperor continued, "You will fail. You will doubt. You will wish for simpler times." He reached out, touched his son's shoulder. "But if you listen to the wind, to the stones, to your own heart, you will learn." The fire crackled once. Louis breathed deeply. "Will the empire survive?" he asked. Charlemagne turned back to the flames. "I don't know," he whispered. "But I hope you remember that it was never meant to be held." He paused, only to be carried for a time. Louis said nothing, but he stayed. Long after the fire began to fade, and when the last ember glowed red, they stood together, father and son. Not rulers, not legends, just two men, in the quiet, watching the night settle over a world too large to own, but not too large to love. And as the stars blinked in the deep velvet sky, Charlemagne knew his time was nearly done, but the silence he had learned to carry would remain, and perhaps that was enough. Winter had returned to Aachen, and it came not as a storm, but as a hush, the kind of cold that silences bird song. softens footsteps and smooths the world into stillness. Snow gathered along the chapel's roofline, settled into the cracks of ancient stones and curled gently against the corners of palace windows. Inside, time moved differently, not slower, just quieter. The emperor sat by a tall, arched window, wrapped in fur-lined robes, his breath fogging the glass as he stared into the white beyond, the garden once bursting with green, and Latin recitations lay empty now. Only a single bench remained visible, half buried in snow like a thought not quite forgotten. Charlemagne blinked slowly. There had been so many springs, so many banners raised, treaties signed, rivers crossed. Now he crossed only memories, and they too seemed harder to navigate with each passing dawn. Behind him, the fire murmured, not roaring, not crackling, just breathing, like an old dog, curled by its master's feet, keeping watch through the long night. A scribe entered the room, young, nervous. He held a scroll in trembling hands, its seal unbroken. From the Danube, sire, he said softly. Charlemagne did not turn. Leave it, he said. The boy hesitated, then bowed and placed the scroll on a nearby table, already crowded with unread reports. He looked once more at the emperor's back, broad, still, wreathed in silence. Then he left. Charlemagne remained. His eyes followed a single snowflake as it slid down the glass, leaving a faint trail that disappeared before it reached the sill. He thought of time like that, falling, sliding, vanishing, before it could be traced. There were no trumpets now, no drums, no shouts from the field, only snow and silence and breath. He had once been everywhere, a crown on his head, steel at his side, a world held together by the weight of his will. Now he sat still and wondered if the world would hold without it. Would his sons remember not just what he built, but why? Would the scholars he had gathered preserve not just language, but meaning? Would the bells he restored still ring when he no longer rose to hear them? His fingers curled slightly around the arm of the chair, not in fear, in feeling. The grain of the wood had grown familiar, smoothed by years, worn by pauses. A throne, yes, but also a memory of every moment he'd waited. Before deciding, a voice came from the doorway. It was soft, unsure. My lord, shall I prepare the chapel? Charlemagne turned just slightly, his face lined but calm. His answer, not yet. Let the snow finish falling. The snow did not stop. It simply softened, flake after flake, descending like forgotten words settling onto parchment. Never read. Aachen held its breath, and inside the stone walls of the emperor's court, time folded. Charlemagne stood with care, not pain, just deliberation. Every movement now was a kind of prayer, every step an echo of the thousands that came before. He walked slowly to the wooden chest beneath the window, unlatched it, opened it. Inside, things not meant for councils or war, things kept, not for the empire, but for the man. A child's wooden horse, a faded ribbon once tied around his daughter's hair, a letter written in a soft, uncertain hand, never sent. He touched each item with quiet fingers, as if not to disturb the memory that slept within them. And then, beneath it all, a folded cloak, frayed, sun-bleached, and once soaked in the rain of northern fields. He held it to his chest, not to remember victory, but to remember the weight of wind on lonely roads. Behind him, a knock, 3 soft taps. Then the voice of his son. "May I enter?" Charlemagne did not answer aloud, only placed the cloak back inside the chest, closed the lid, and turned. "Come." Louis stepped in slowly, like a boy entering his father's study. Though he was no longer a boy, he was taller now, tired but steady. He held no scroll, no sword, just presence. "Your hands are cold," Charlemagne said. Gesturing to the fire, Louis moved toward it, sat, stared into the orange. They remained that way for some time, 2 figures formed by years, by war, by blood, and silence. Finally, Charlemagne broke the hush. "You will be emperor soon." Louis said nothing. "I did not plan for it to happen this soon," Charlemagne continued. "But time does not ask." Still, Louis said nothing. Charlemagne studied him, his son's face carved by worry, by expectation. He saw in him not ambition, but burden, and something else, something he had once carried himself. "Do you fear it?" the old emperor asked. Louis nodded. "Yes." A pause. "Good," Charlemagne said. Another silence, this one softer. Louis finally looked at him. "What if I fail?" Charlemagne leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the question fill the room. Then he spoke. "Then fail with grace." Louis's brow furrowed. "Fail wisely, fail as one who seeks to learn, not as one who seeks to rule alone." He reached for a nearby book, not a law code, not a charter, but a psalter. He handed it to Louis. "This will help more." Then the sword. Louis accepted it with both hands, as if it might break. Outside, the snow continued, soft, patient, and in that moment, the throne did not matter, nor the title. Only the warmth of the fire, the hush of falling light, and a father passing down. Something deeper than command. He was not teaching his son to rule. He was teaching him how to carry the silence. By evening, the palace had dimmed, not from weariness, but from reverence. Torches were not lit in the outer halls. Only lanterns glowed behind drawn curtains, casting warm halos. On cold walls, the servants spoke in murmurs as if raising their voices might disturb something sacred and unseen. Word had passed. Without being spoken, the emperor was nearing the end. But inside his chamber, there was no mourning, only peace. Charlemagne sat upright still, wrapped in a fur cloak, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of his chair, as though feeling for the pulse of the world he had shaped. The fire burned low but steady. No flicker, no fade, just warmth. He watched it, eyes soft, lost somewhere between memory and dream. In the distance, a bell rang, not the great bell of Aachen, a smaller one, a chapel bell farther down the hill. It marked none of the canonical hours. It simply rang once, twice, then silence. Charlemagne smiled faintly. He remembered the day he ordered that chapel built, not for bishops, not for nobles, but for travelers, pilgrims, the tired, the lost, a place where anyone could kneel. He closed his eyes, and he remembered his mother's voice singing to him on stormy nights in the timber-board house at Herstal. He remembered his first horse, a stubborn golden thing with one dark eye. He remembered the Saxon forests, deep and terrible, and the sound of a battle before it began. He remembered Rome, the Pope's hands, the weight of the crown. He remembered his children, one by one, their first cries, their first questions, their first failures. He remembered his brother's laughter and the silence that followed it. He remembered letters from cloisters on distant cliffs praising the schools he had built. He remembered the ones he could not save, the fields that did not bloom, the roads that never finished, the prayers unanswered. He remembered it all, and in that remembering he felt no regret, only gravity, a quiet settling of all that had been. The door creaked. He did not turn. He already knew the shape of the steps. It was Alcuin, his old friend, his teacher, his mirror. The monk knelt quietly beside him, placing a hand on the arm of the chair. "You look tired," Alcuin said gently. Charlemagne chuckled. "I look eternal," a pause, which is another way of saying, "I'm nearly gone." Alcuin nodded, tears caught in the corners of his eyes. "There is more I wished to finish," Charlemagne whispered. "There always is," Alcuin replied. The fire shifted, casting new shadows on the wall behind them. What did it all mean? The emperor asked. "Your reign?" Charlemagne shook his head. "No, the effort, the burden, the flame." Alcuin was quiet for a long time, then said, "It meant that you tried to hold back the dark, and for a while you did." Charlemagne leaned his head back, let out a slow breath that seemed to carry centuries. "No glory remains forever," he murmured. "But kindness might." Alcuin stood, his hand still resting on the emperor's shoulder. Then, softly, "I will pray for you tonight." Charlemagne smiled. "No need." He looked toward the fire once more. "Just remember me as someone who listened." And in the quiet, the two men remained, the scholar and the king, side by side. One last time. The halls of Aachen grew quiet, not from command, but from reverence. Servants walked slower, doors opened more softly. The clatter of boots gave way to slippered steps and lowered voices. They knew, though no herald spoke it, no proclamation announced it, the air itself had shifted, and still, in the emperor's chamber, all was calm. Charlemagne lay upon a modest bed, not draped in silk, but in wool, plain, thick, the kind worn by shepherds and pilgrims. He had chosen it. His crown rested on a small table beside him, not on a pillow, not on velvet, just beside an old wooden cross and a cup of cool broth. The candle near the bed burned low, its flame thin and persistent, flickering like breath in a sleeping lung. Louis sat nearby, head bowed, not praying, just listening to the sound of his father's breath. Slower now, but steady, each inhale a tether to the world of earth and stone, each exhale a thread growing thinner with every passing minute. A priest murmured songs at the far end of the room. His voice cracked, not from age, from awe. Charlemagne's eyes fluttered open. They were dimmed now like the last coals of a fire, but still alive. He looked toward Louis and smiled faintly. "You're still here," he whispered. Louis nodded, words catching in his throat. "I will stay." Charlemagne nodded slowly. "Good. The world is loud. Let someone remember it's quiet." He reached, with fingers no longer firm, toward the space beside him. Louis leaned forward, took his hand, felt its weight, its stillness. "I wanted more time," Louis said, barely above a breath. Charlemagne smiled again. "There's always more to build, but sometimes you must learn to dwell in what was built." A pause, then another. The candle trembled. "I was never a saint," the emperor whispered. Louis did not speak. He only pressed his father's hand, as if to say, "You were enough." Charlemagne turned his gaze upward, toward the ceiling beams he had ordered carved years ago. They showed the heavens, stars, angels, visions of a perfect city. Not Rome, not Jerusalem, but something beyond both. "Do you think," he whispered, "they will remember?" Louis didn't answer, but the priest did. "Every time a boy learns to read, sire, every time a field is spared from war, every time a church bell rings where there was once only silence." Charlemagne closed his eyes. A tear slipped past, weathered lashes, rolled down his cheek, and vanished into linen. "I wanted peace," he said. "You gave it," Louis replied. For a time, Charlemagne exhaled, a long, slow breath, like wind through pine. "Yes," he whispered, "and that is all we ever truly hold." Outside, the snow had begun again, soft, endless flakes falling without hurry, without sound. Hakan slept. The city he had shaped with laws and stones now cradled him. In return, the chapel bells did not ring that hour. They would wait. The candle by the bed dipped once, twice, then held. Charlemagne's eyes remained closed, but his face calm, free. Louis bent low, kissed his father's brow. "You are remembered," he whispered, then stood and stepped back, allowing the moment, its stillness, and in that quiet the emperor's chest rose one final time, then fell, and did not rise again. The priest finished the song. Without pause, the candle still burned, its flame no longer a sentinel, but a witness. The Emperor was gone, but his warmth remained in the scrolls, in the stones, in the hearts of those who knew the burden of peace and dared to carry it forward. Outside, in the fields beyond the palace, a child ran through the snow, laughing, not because he understood, but because the world still turned, and perhaps that was the true legacy, that life continued, that morning would come, and in its light something new would always begin.